I want to talk through a little bit of API design today. And I specifically want to talk about data and what does data actually mean? Because I think that the context of, the system that you're working in and what type of data you're dealing with is going to influence, okay, what is our definition of what data means for us? Is data just what's useful? Is data logs? Is data the exceptions? Is data the file that the data is coming from? What is it? So it's important to think that in your initial API design, meetings, workshops, planning, whatever it may be, that you come up with your formal definition for what data means for you. And what does it mean in the context of your system? Because if you want to include exception handling or errors as part of data, you need, I think, to call that out because one difficult part that you're going to encounter, especially when it comes to API design work, is when do you want to throw the exception and how should you handle it? Do you just want to log the error or do you want to send it or propagate it to some other spot in the code and handle it accordingly? It's a difficult thing to think through because it requires a lot of like knowledge about what the future state looks like. And it requires knowledge about what, again, data means for you. Is it necessary for your system to both know the data or the state of the object that's being acted upon, in addition to any of the potential exceptions that arise or are thrown? Is it important for your system to throw exceptions, or is it just important for your system to be, to be aware that an exception was handled? And so these are the kind of questions that are going to not only guide how you go about creating your API, but they're going to guide your definition of what data means. And if you say, for example, that data means that we collect everything, we collect, logs. If you're on a Windows machine, you can collect event logs. If you want to collect exceptions, you want to collect all the state obviously for whatever object you're acting upon, whether that's JSON, XML, a file, whatever, a CSV file, whatever it may be. Let's just say for our example that we want to say that everything is data, which is a guiding principle actually behind some API designs. So if we go with the principle that everything truly is data, that will guide us to creating some kind of wrapper class around our data that's generic enough that can be propagated throughout our entire API. And this is important because this is going to have to be not a super early, like not a first decision made, but I would say a rather earlier decision, definitely before the latter half of the API work. And especially as you're writing out your interfaces and as you're kind of stubbing out your service methods and controllers and defining models and DTO objects, it's going to be important somewhere along the line that you figure out what that wrapper object is going to look like that's going to house your data. If you've ever worked with F Sharp or some kind of functional language, you may have come across a unit. And this is just one of many examples, but a unit can be a generic return type that can house your data. So it might be helpful to create that type of approach if you are operating under the philosophy that everything is data. Because if you don't create kind of a generic wrapper around your data, it's going to be hard to propagate everything you need. Now you can do it in one model or a class, but it gets a little bit complicated because you have to say then, are you saying that your model is just a model and then you have a separate DTO that you then map to the model, and then it just again it just warrants it. How are we going to do this? Rather, if you have a generic wrapper, then you can define properties. And again, it just warrants a discussion. But if you have that generic wrapper, then it can be used across all your endpoints, especially if you're using that philosophy across multiple endpoints. So if we say everything is data, and we collect, 3 exceptions that were handled, we logged, 10 different things with various pieces of data, and we changed our engine, horsepower from 45 up to 50, some arbitrary example like that. The data that we could collect from that will be something like maybe 10 log statements with XYZ timestamp, the specific exceptions with the message, maybe the inner exception, wherever that exception, message and whatever else may be that we want to use, we can put it in our return object, and also obviously the state of the engine and maybe what values changed. In addition to that, if we're dealing with an API, we might want to include links for whatever other, however other, whatever other endpoints are available to us that can act on the state of the engine. Again, dealing with that hypertext as the engine of the application state model. And so if we take all that into consideration, you can see how it kind of makes sense to kind of create that generic wrapper class. But again, what got us here is having some kind of definition of what data is. Now, if we don't care about any of that, if we just care truly about the engine state, the state of the engine, and we just care about what is the horsepower value and what did it change to, we could simply be fine returning a JSON object with those two values, and that would be appropriate for our system if that's all that was required, and we know it's not going to change beyond that. So again, it depends what your definition of data is. If we don't care anything about logs or exceptions, we just want to know one thing, and we're just going to throw whenever an exception is raised or caught, and that we're just going to fault out of the code, then that's what we do, and we don't have to return that. But if we say we want to be a little bit more, graceful of exception handling, then you might want to treat your exceptions as data and have those be accessible. And so again, that was just a very simplistic example, but the question of what is data got us there. And so I think that if you're having these team discussions and you're having API design workshops, I think it will be valuable to ask the question of what is data, probably around one of the earlier meetings, because I think it's going to probably guide some decisions that are made about the API later on, or at least that's how I see it, right? But there's many different philosophies about API design, and there's many different viewpoints about what data is and what truly constitutes data. And so I think it really depends what your use case is. I think it depends what your system is, but I think it's a good conversation to have. But it can be hard because it's so broad, right? It covers so many topics, right? Because you could have an hour meeting just on exception handling. How do we want to do that? Do we want to throw? What is the alerting going to be? How are we going to handle these? There's so much to unpack there, and that conversation about exception handling guides a lot of decision making about code too. And then you can talk about from there, you can talk about, okay, how are we going to implement logging? That can be another implementation meeting. And you can just see how this keeps unpacking and unpacking. But again, these are all necessary conversations to have at some point, because I think it's not only going to help you code whatever it is you're making, but it's going to help everyone else kind of get in sync to what you're doing and provide input or changes or fixes. So again, it's good to just communicate what it is you're working on and doing. And data certainly is a large piece of that. So let me know what y'all think, and let me know what your philosophy of what data is. And yeah, that's all I got for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.